And welcome to another exciting episode of Blether Together, the National's breakdown of news and politics from Scotland and around the world, coming to you every Thursday at 3 p.m. My name is Stephen Paton, and joining me today in our studio is Maggie Chapman, the co-convener of the Scottish Green Party.
Hello.
Hello. And also Robert Somynne, who is a commentator and writer of many thoughts. So thank you both for coming in today and joining me for our little chat about what's been going on. As always, we do want to hear what you also think as well, so please do leave your comments down below. We will be watching them, and if you want to help us reach a wider audience, give us a wee share and a like. That's always appreciated. And a hey to George, who I think is the first person to come in and say hello to us this week. Hey. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show as always. So I'd like to start this week with I guess a bit of a light-hearted look at independence. This week, Donald Trump came out and said that independence would be terrible for Scotland. So come to you first, Maggie.
Yeah.
Is this the game changer that the Yes movement needed to suddenly find 70% of support?
I mean, the idea that Trump likes something might be a good thing for us is probably not too far off the mark for some people anyway. But I think it's, it speaks to a broader arrogance of his politics and a broader sense that actually he doesn't have a clue what's going on in Scotland on the ground. He doesn't have a clue how communities function here, how we relate to the wider UK political scene. And also that golf might be as important as democracy, and independence, I think, is a bit of a joke. So.
Because that was at the point was that if we go independent, we won't be able to hold the Open anymore.
The
British Open, as he called it, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Robert?
I think it's quite interesting that pro-union commentators haven't really said much about it.
No.
Which is unlike what happened when Barack Obama, the previous president, mentioned that Scotland should stay as part of the UK, and they were all over that because obviously, it suited them. I think it points to a wider problem about celebrity endorsements. I've always been a bit sceptical of that. I don't think actually a lot of people pay attention to celebrity endorsements. I don't think people actually care about it. People will make up their own minds in a private way, or talking amongst their families or political people that they know. I also am quite tired of, you get this exhaustion with sort of, looking at how stupid he is and his opinions and how brutish and coarse he is, and I think a lot of people just would have switched off to it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a sort of sense why before he was president of the United States, why was he commenting on Scottish politics? What did it have to do with him? And I think there's a legacy of that still. There's a misunderstanding of so much of foreign policy from his point of view. Never mind the peculiarities of Scottish politics. I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is interesting, that lack of attention, that lack of any kind of care given to those commenters from people who would maybe not share our ideas on independence.
And it's not like it wouldn't be unlike Trump to just sort of like run into a debate without fully understanding what he was talking about.
Indeed.
And exactly,
Indeed.
But I think you're right. Like, why is no one talking about it? It's like, well, because Trump says a lot. He just says things all the time and announces things on Twitter, and it's kind of like where maybe it's coming from Obama. It's kind of like independence would be bad, and people are like, oh, okay, there's maybe ramifications here to
he's
the trade.
He's thought about it. And
exactly, he's kind of like
he
considered
understands
it.
some of the
and
wider
even
context.
Exactly, and even if you don't agree with the position, as I imagine a lot of our viewers absolutely don't, you kind of understand that he has a position that is strategical. Trump is concerned about golf. It's not,
and his own business interests.
And his own business, exactly. And as it often comes back to with Donald Trump, actually, which is usually where are his business interests and how can he benefit them, which is I imagine something he's probably going to be remembered for down the line once he's no longer president. It's going to be seeing very much a president who used that time to further his own interests in a lot of ways. But of course, this week for Donald Trump as well, or just the White House in general, has been kind of chaotic as well, because we also saw the departure of the Mooch, the communications guy who lasted all of 10 days.
It's a good round number.
It's clean, yes.
Exactly.
That's true.
But I think the thing about this is it's incredible is the guy to go into that position, he sold his business, he lost his wife, he missed the birth of his child, and then after 10 days, it's just like, actually, off you pop.
Sacrifice for the cause.
To make America great again.
Exactly.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah.
That's working well so far.
But yeah, I mean, Robert, what do you think of the state of the White House actually is?
It's really interesting. You can analyse the confusion in the White House on a number of levels. So obviously a lot of the commentary that a lot of the write policy, and Trump is obviously in a battle with the Republicans who know they can't get rid of him because they'd be left with a weakened Pence as president. There'd be the risk of them being damaged in the midterm elections. They've also got the prospect of a Democratic president replacing Trump in the long run. The risk of impeachment is just too much for them. But then you also got this battle between sort of the establishment security apparatus in the CIA, the Pentagon, the State Department, or the so-called US deep state, and this whole situation with the connections with Russia that Trump has. So just on a number of levels, it's quite interesting analysing where Trump is. I just feel that this is a person who has lived in the corporate world, but hasn't even performed in a decent way in the corporate world. It is very haphazard the way in which he conducts himself, certainly in terms of his business. And he's been obviously brought into the White House through last year's election, and he hasn't been able to sort of fall into line with the traditions of how you become a president in the US. Having said that, I kind of differ on a lot of the things that he's done. So, for example, the whole Russia thing. I find that it's interesting seeing Democrats who have been the object of smears that they got connection to the Soviets, that they're too left-wing over the past 50 years, now switch to be the McCarthyites. And in many ways, Trump, of course, is a reprehensible character, but a lot of the things that he's doing have been jumped on in an emotional way. And I think when you look at the American political process, you see a White House that is disorganized, but you also see a Democratic Party which has lost itself as well. I remember talking to a colleague who's in Newsweek, and they were talking about the new slogans that the Democratic Party are trying to come up with for the midterms. It's absolute disaster. It's really cliched slogans, and a sense that a political party which its raison d'etre is oppose Trump. And of course, that wasn't enough in the presidential election. You need a progressive actual set of policies.
I think it's interesting. It's indicative, to me anyway, of a much more deeply rooted crisis within democracy, within the states. I mean, we've had little bits and pieces of that in the UK, around Scottish independence referendum, European referendum last year, but there's something much deeper and more profound about it, or at least how it's been. The impacts of it on ordinary people in the States, perhaps. And I think that's something that certainly I get the sense in Scotland we've got some way of dealing with some of those issues because we built a movement, but there doesn't seem to be that same kind of approach to be able to really understand what's going on the ground for people, and for people to in turn understand how their political system works. You said you talked about making the whole Trump presidency not following tradition and that kind of, and in some ways that's actually no bad thing because sometimes traditions need a shake up. Yeah. But the whole complete disengagement, or the abuse of that disengagement by Trump and to some extent by the Democrats is, I think, a symptom of something much much more worrying and much deeper.
Yeah. But I mean, this week alone, just for Trump, there were 3 people walked at the White House over the course of the week. Communication at the end of it, it's been a chaotic week for the White House. Even though Trump says the White House is fine, everything's fine, which is
it's a good day at work.
Which is his usual fallback. Is everything's fine. I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, do you think this could be? Everyone's been talking about impeaching Trump or the end of Trump for a while now. That could still be a way. But I mean, is this is it starting getting to the point where it's an inevitability by this point? Do you think?
I don't know. I think as we've been talking about, it's quite difficult to see the advantages. There are advantages of getting rid of Trump, but there are also some significant risks, as Robert has pointed out. And I think there are. I mean, the challenge or the impact of that alone on democracy, when people, it's not a popular rising up against him. Anyway, I think if that starts, then maybe there's more. They might be more legs in that kind of story. I think it's because if with this constant the structures of democracy, I think that's only going to be bad for democracy in the longer term, never mind who's in the White House. I think that becomes irrelevant to some extent. If the structures are broken, if the people don't feel that anything they do matters, well, what is the point?
Yeah, it's not one individual
No.
demagogue that threatens democracy. You know, democratic traditions and institutions break down,
And the structures are in them, yeah.
when people lose faith.
Yeah.
When there's no two-way conversation between the institutions and the people. And the way in which Trump has been critiqued as one man, as one demagogue that we have to take away, and then we can just return to some heavenly normal. You know, that's not what needs to be done. What you need is to not only remove the person, but actually tackle the underlying issues.
And refresh those institutions and structures, yeah, make them work for people.
Yeah.
Speaking of refreshing democratic institutions and structures, of course, independence has been kind of like something that's been broadly talked about this week as well online. But we're going to focus in on just one part of that because there's a lot to get into from this week. But no, this week in the National, there was a piece published by Kevin McKenna who discussed that to a degree the SNP have actually been quite arrogant when it came to the independence movement and trying to like sort of own it and saying that the only vehicle for independence is essentially the SNP, or at least that's certainly one of the ways that they have behaved, even if not outright saying so. And of course, the Scottish Independence Convention's been kind of like building a little bit of steam recently, and Nicola Sturgeon has said she's going to go speak to them. I mean, Maggie, do you think that there has been a degree of like the movement funneling behind a party, and that this is something we should actually be moving away from?
I suppose a couple of things. Firstly, for me, independence has never been an end goal in and of itself. It's a means to an end, and that end for me is a more democratic, more socially just, more environmentally coherent and just Scotland, where everybody has a say in the way in which their society functions and works. And no one party, I think, can ever deliver that. You know, we saw, for me, the legacy of the independence campaign from 2014 was the movement, was the movement that was a melting pot of radical ideas, of sometimes diametrically opposing ideas or visions, but through those discussions, through those debates, came a creativity we hadn't seen in British politics for a very, very long time. And I think still Scotland owns that in a way that even with Corbyn, you know, we don't see that happening elsewhere in the United Kingdom. And I think, yes, clearly as the party of government, it's very easy for the SNP to say they are the party of government, they need to take a lead, they need to show the way. But really, the strength is in the movement. You know, and you look at movements across the world, movements elsewhere in Europe, the anti-apartheid movement, which was global in the end. It wasn't just let's get behind one man or one woman or one party. It was a whole range of people from a whole range of different societies coming together and say, this is wrong, we need to change it, these are the ways we can do that. And I think that's the real strength. That's the kind of politics I want to advocate. You know, I'm a pluralist politician, I'm a member of the Scottish Greens, I'm co-convener of the Scottish Greens, but I don't think, you know, I don't believe that any one party in Scotland can deliver all that there is for Scotland's future. I think that's an incredibly arrogant position to have if that's what people think. And it's also, it takes away from the wealth and diversity and the creativity of all of the people who live in Scotland. I think, you know, to say it just has to be this little group over here or this very big group over here, no, that's not the kind of independence I want. And I don't think it's the kind of independence that the movement generally wants. It's about having a breadth of ideas, having the space to have discussions and disagreements and coming up with something that is better. You know, we can do it. You know, one of the examples I think that we've seen work in that cross-party and non-party way very, very well was the Women for Independence campaign against the women's prison. You know, a very clear statement of intent from the government. Women for Indy came together and said, no. And for, you know, and put forward a very strong case, showed themselves to be non-partisan, bringing together the best for a social situation, and that is what prevailed. And I think those are the kinds of things where that's why the movement is so absolutely vital, and we need to, as a movement, you know, I'm a member of the Scottish Independence Convention as well, and we are so clear in the way we think and we work that we aren't about one party or another. It's about the broader movement and the broader independence campaign, and that's our strength.
Mm. And do you think, Robert, there's actually almost a danger in associating one party too strongly with the independence movement, even if the movement itself is, for example, not wanting to do that? Like, if one party does come to be synonymous with the movement, is there a danger there?
I think that the danger has really already happened, but I question how much you can blame the SNP for that. I think there are issues with structures of information, the way information is spread in Scotland, institutions of the media. I mean, certainly for me, coming from England, coming from sort of an English left-wing tradition, I was inspired by the independence movement. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, things like the Scottish Independence Convention, that's what I lived for, because I actually saw a country on the grassroots where people were thinking about the very fundamental ways in which we live our lives, and that will always be inspiring. But in many ways, you know, you can't help that being overlooked by media organisations which themselves, in a cultural sense, don't understand grassroots movements. I mean, I recall, you know, media institutions like the BBC or certain newspapers really late on, you know, understanding that there were organisations that were on the grassroots, that were organising, that were separate. And I think it was genuine. I think a lot of media outlets and journalists simply did not understand that there was that basic separation. And I suppose that just comes down to, as well, you know, the space for a new media and new methods of communication. I think the movement, the burden has fallen on the movement itself to separate itself off of the SNP and to explain to people, look, we're separate. We have a whole range of, you know, diverse ideas and people. One thing that I'd like to add on to that is I wouldn't so much describe the SNP as arrogant, but confused, actually. Confused in a lot of its ideological positions. So, I mean, take, for example, during the election, the commentary on Corbyn. On one side, Corbyn's terrible on Brexit, inconsistent, weak. On the other hand, yeah, we'd form a coalition of progress with him. It's kind of like, you know, you need to kind of make up your mind. And I think a lot of voters actually spotted that, especially a lot of sort of indie left voters that maybe switched over to Labour because of Corbyn later on. But there's also issues around, you know, whether it's issues around how oil is used or issues around Europe. And I was talking to someone like Callum McCaig, who's, you know, a fantastic person, but I remember him, you know, toying with the idea of being maybe part of EFTA, but then also understanding that, you know, SNP supporters are pro-European Union. So there were a whole range of issues that I think the SNP felt that it had stretched itself too thin. And I think that just comes with natural triangulation. It comes with being the party of governance for so long. And it comes with being that dominant force because the media presents you as that. I mean, certainly they entertain that idea, but I think it is down to information and the fact that a lot of people weren't given an accurate picture of the Yes movement and the Yes campaign, that actually you had political parties were relatively small.
And also, I suppose that, I mean, many SNP members are much, much more radical than their government. You know, they want to ban fracking. They want a transition for the North East, as you say, away from oil to a sustainable economy. And their government's not delivering that for a whole range of reasons. You know, and I think it's a mismatch. It's confusion. I think it's a fundamental. We are learning how to be a democracy again. Because I don't think we have had a genuine democratic process or structure for the last 30 or 40 years. And that takes time. You know, maybe the movement gets it much more quickly, and the politicians and the institutions are slow to catch up. And we as members of that movement need to say, actually, no, hang on, this is what you do. This is how we are going to do democracy in our future. And it is about the government speaking for the people, not having, you know, and listening to the people, and not just going off on their own without, and leaving their support base, their member base, and the movement behind. I think that's something that we all have in engaging. It's not just, oh, the SNP have to sort this out. No, it's all of our jobs to sort this out.
Yeah. And I think talking about policy there specifically is one of the issues for me about a party becoming too synonymous with independence, because ultimately then the argument doesn't become about the merits of independence, it becomes about the policy of that particular party, particularly if it's one in government. So a criticism of the SNP's stance on oil or whatever else becomes a criticism of independence. By extent of that, if it doesn't work for this, then the case for independence, therefore the case for independence crumbles as a result. Which is why I'm actually looking forward to seeing more involvement from, or rather more coming out of like the SIC and like institutions that are not connected to a specific party, but rather are kind of more focused on the movement as a whole, a partyless movement ultimately, because then ultimately we can focus in on the specific points of independence, not necessarily what comes after it, but the reasons that it is achievable and doable and desirable ultimately as well.
It's also about, I think, culture as well. Modern Scotland is obviously trying to wrestle itself away from an established British culture, but British culture is rooted to the idea of partisan politics. It's rooted to the institution of the party.
It's that parliamentary process that doesn't really allow for anything beyond that.
It's like when you ask someone, "Are you political?" They'd say no, because I'm not a member of a party. I don't really vote. I don't really listen to the politicians. Whereas if you talk to an average member of the Scottish Independence Convention or someone who attends, they are political. They're not necessarily a member of a party, but they're passionate about a certain area of their life and a certain area of their community and a certain topic.
And I think it's for exactly that reason why the movement is so important, and those of us who have voices in that movement have a really important role to play in stating that and restating that again and again. And I think one of the things certainly that I feel has got lost in the whole discussion recently is the focus on why we want independence. And for me, that's the discussion. Those are the conversations we need to recap having again. Not the date of the next referendum necessarily, although we know that's an issue. But why do we even want one? Why do we want a referendum? Why is independence important? What is it about Scotland that is broken now that independence will allow us to fix? And to me, it's, as I said, it's those issues around creating a more equal society, a society where no one is left behind, a society where the rich don't just keep on getting richer and richer and richer while the poor really, really, really suffer. And that's what we need to get back to. And it's going to be much, much easier, I think, although maybe it shouldn't be, but it is going to be much easier for the movement to do that than for any one political party.
Okay. So for anyone tuning in, you are watching Blether Together, which is the National's weekly breakdown of news and politics from Scotland and around the world. We're here every Thursday at 3 p.m, so thank you for tuning in. And we do want to hear what you think about what we are talking about, so please do leave your comments down below. We are watching them as they come in. Now, speaking of Scottish culture as well, that actually brings up an interesting story from today, which was published in the National about Scotland's History Police, which is it's quite a sort of interesting little initiative. Katrina Stevenson, who runs Clyde Coast Tourism, is kind of run this sort of online forum called the History Police, which is kind of a place to bring up where museums around Scotland are ultimately sort of, I guess, failing telling the truth, or rather the facts around some elements of Scotland's history. So, for example, they were recently involved in this news story about the Isle of Arran, where a museum kind of, when discussing the clearances, framed it as agricultural reform rather than people literally being forced off the land and having to move away and not really having much of a say on it at all. And the clearances are something that I'd argue in certain parts of Scotland are kind of played down and aren't really well known. I mean, Maggie, do you think that there are areas in Scotland's history that was sort of are worth bringing back up again to discuss?
I mean, the easy answer to that is yes, of course. I think that one of the issues with so much of the way in which history has been taught not by everybody, but by some people, is it fails to actually analyse or present history as a product of inequality and a product of the elite. It's the elites, it's those who win, who tell the stories. And with the clearances, with the Scottish troops being on the front line and subjugating people in the British Empire, those kinds of relationships are never really teased out in the same way as we might wish them to be, to, as you say, get to the reality of what it was like. What it was like for people living or trying to eke out a living. You know, the clearances, I think, probably maybe has a little bit more, gets a little bit more time and discussion now than it used to, which is a good thing. But you know, what was going on with that, the way crofting was set up. You know, crofts couldn't support the whole family, so often the only option for people was to go into the army. And what was the British Army doing? Empire. You know, so all of those things are connected, and I don't think we make enough of those connections, and we don't make enough of the realities of that and Scott's role in that, so we can understand how not to do it again. You know, I think that's one of the things that I think is really, really important about this. Understanding why those situations arose, what it meant then for people who struggled to survive, what they had to do to survive, and what the consequences of that were. You know, we are still living through the consequences of colonialism in the British Empire, and yes, I say that as somebody from a former colony, but that's not why I'm saying it. I think it's true regardless of where you come from.
And speaking of, like, I guess the way that the history is shaped from in the eyes of the oppressor, for people who are in a position where they are the ones who either, like you say, have to go into the army to survive, are being forced off their land. But at the same time, there's the other side of, like, not Scotland the oppressed, but rather Scotland the oppressor. Specifically, the role that Scotland played in the British Empire. Again, like you're saying, being put over there. And Robert, you actually were speaking about this at the weekend, specifically how, in a way, Scotland's almost got a free pass because we sort of managed to build up this thing over time of being separate from it, as if it was something that happened to us as much as anything else, when in fact we were an active part in it.
Yeah, it was an event at the Empire Cafe. It's a fantastic event set up by Jude Barber and Louise Welsh. I do think it's interesting when you go around the world, and Scotland has a very positive image, even from former colonies.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know, the whole idea of the Inglesi being the Ferengi that oppressed. I think it's also about who owns history, because you know, nation states are based on myths. They're based on stories, and whoever can tell their story, whoever's perspective is put up front, has power today. Because obviously history is not the past; it's constantly the present. I think it's something that has to be dealt in a really constructive way. I mean, I'm someone who, I'm not really interested in blame, and I'm not interested in sort of unconstructive arguments where it just turns into a shouting match. I'm interested about what history teaches us and what we can learn. So the fact that, you know, we've been in Afghanistan, saying the British have been in Afghanistan, I think 8 separate occasions, all which ended in failure. From the 1800s onwards, is kind of a lesson that sending troops into Afghanistan is perhaps not the best thing to do. If we had learnt that as a form of history in our popular memory, then that affects political decision making. That affects the way that people interact with their governments. It affects the way people interact with each other. It affects the way different ethnic groups interact with each other. We learn to, you know, respect each other more. We learn to see ourselves as a community which cares about one another, which cares about the oppressed, not just in relation to us, but cares about the oppressed abroad. We care about bombs being dropped in Yemen by Saudi jets armed by ourselves, because we understand our history of imperialism. We understand the role that British soldiers played in Yemen as late as the 1970s, for example, with sort of the interrogations and tortures there. So all this matters, because again, history is not the past, it's the present, and it's not about us feeling kind of ashamed or guilty or angry or argumentative. It's about thinking, okay, what does this tell us? And
how do we understand it for today?
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things I remember very clearly when growing up in Zimbabwe, we didn't do very much. We did virtually no Scottish history. It was English history of the British Empire, and I remember when I discovered that Robert Burns was going to go off to the West Indies to work on a slave plantation. And you think, but hang on, how does that work? And what does that say? You know, yes, you know, actually not talking about the whole slavery element and the atrocities around that, but what does that say to the value of a poet and the value of culture and the arts? And you can almost see us repeating some of those same economic and political decisions now. Actually, we don't care about the creative industries, we don't care about the arts, we're not going to support them, we're not going to fund them, and therefore what do we expect those people to do? And are we pushing them into an economic system, into an economic life, into social systems that are that have oppression and inequality at their heart? And I think that that's something for us to take very seriously now, and it's something for us to think about how do we restructure things so we don't make the same mistakes, and we don't say to people, actually, if you can't wield a weapon, or if you can't. And it can be a military weapon, it can be an economic weapon. If you can't do that, then you are of no value to society. I think that's a huge problem for our politics. We have solutions around, things like universal basic income, around, having a truly distributive tax system, that kind of thing. But we can't disconnect those two things. They function together, they work together, they create the kind of society that we're living through and recreating and reproducing.
And it's also about commemoration, commemoration and history as well. What do we respect? Do we respect and honour prestige and power, or do we actually pay homage to those sort of radical traditions? It's certainly of interest to me, coming from the English left, that there's a whole ream of names that I discovered going off to uni. I've never heard of these people before, and the average person in the street wouldn't have heard of them. And that's so powerful to how people conceive of pride in themselves. Is it pride based on domination? Is it pride based on how much you can enforce other people to your will, and a destructive will economically and militarily? Or is it actually pride in bringing people together, a kind of constructive form of solidarity that's not only based in the past but also is an action in the present?
And speaking of, I guess, like collective pride, historical pride around the empire, let's talk about Brexit. So this has been an interesting one this week. I found it quite fascinating. The Daily Mail ran their front cover this week was a story around tougher passport checks impacting British citizens, where there were delays because British citizens were having to go through these tougher passport checks now, which was ultimately causing longer times waiting in queues. And they were complaining about this, and I couldn't help but kind of, sort of give it a double look, because if we're leaving the EU, that's just one small part of everything that's coming towards the UK right now. And I think there is still that sort of collective feeling in the UK of being special somehow, that we can leave the EU, but why are we not getting all the benefits of staying in the EU, like with these passport checks, particularly since the Daily Mail was one of those who actively campaigned for it. We've had these tougher passport checks, and also this week there was news breaking that apparently UK farmers are currently setting up businesses in Poland ahead of Brexit, which the irony of that, I'm just not going to really get into. But, is this the beginnings of reality starting to hit for some people who maybe had been carrying that empire mentality?
No. I mean, nation matters, and people's conceptions of nation matters. I mean, there was the research that came out that 40% of a particular, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was quite a big section of over 65s that voted for Brexit would totally tolerate one of their loved ones losing a job, or losing a significant amount of their economic power because of Brexit, because for them the nostalgia, the narrative of nation, country absolutely matters. It was interesting referring back to this awful piece I read in the Times. Forgive me for reading the Times, but I couldn't help myself. Michael Gove wrote about Theresa May coming from a sort of an English Catholic background, and then he made a comparison between the EU and the Holy Roman Empire, and he threw in a dash of Armada there and Sir Francis Drake. And it's comical, but it's very important to understand the mentality of people that we're dealing with. A lot of people voted for Brexit, for horrible reasons. Some voted for reasonable reasons. Some were completely bamboozled and lied to. But that narrative of, especially within the case of England, plucky little England standing against the might of continental Europe, the Armada, the Catholic Church, that's deep in the bloodstream. And it doesn't matter how much damage is inflicted. That's the conception of nation. That's the narrative of nation that is so soaked into the bone that there's going to be a large section of the population that would never see sense, even after damage is inflicted upon them.
But I think that there's a really interesting generational dimension to that, because it's not by accident that it's the over 65s that think, it's fine for a loved one to lose a job, because 40 years ago, you could walk out of a job on a Friday and walk into a new one on a Monday. And that hasn't been the case. That's not the case now. It hasn't been the case for a good number of years. It's not the experience of people born, millennials, people born from the early 80s on. That is not their experience of life. And I think, yes, there are people over 65 who voted to remain part of the European Union, who would agree with us on a whole range of these issues. Yeah. But the contexts of their lives are so far removed now from the context of people younger than them, generations younger than me. And I think that's one of the things that we, with an interest in politics, with an interest and a role to play in politics, I think we have to work out how it is that we engage people who aren't over 65, who engage the next generation and really let them speak, let their voices be heard, let them actually design their own future, because I don't want to leave it to the people who think it's fine to lose jobs. I really don't. It's not good enough. And yet that's where we are. So it speaks to all the things you were talking about around that very deeply ingrained sense of what nostalgia around nationhood is, but also to a much clearer structural inequality around power and political power and how it's wielded across and between and two generations.
And do you think that as we get closer to the Brexit date, the day we're meant to be leaving, that we're going to start to see, I guess, more support for this call for like another referendum to like, okay, well, we've come this far. Do we check the box, or do we just change our minds and back out now?
That's an interesting one. I think the mess is going to become ever messier. It's messy now. It's messy. We can talk about passports. We can talk about chlorinated chicken. We can talk about all sorts of really hideous things that but we didn't know that before we voted in June last year. Well, no, you didn't. But I think that there's also something about how it is that we can sustain an interest and a value of the political system or the political structures that we have to use, even if we know we don't like them, we know they're not perfect. We have to use them now until we redesign them. I think that's one of our key challenges, and it's ensuring that we respect people's views in that, even if they are different to our own. In Scotland, I think we're in a very different position to the rest of the UK because we know what we voted against leaving the European Union, and there's a clear majority for that position in the Scottish Parliament. And I think if we're talking about democracy, that's what is important, given that there isn't an overwhelming drive to leave the European Union. It's almost like it's going to happen now, isn't it? That's not a passionate movement. That's a sort of an oppressed people and fed up and resigned people, and I think that's really sad. That's tragic for politics.
Yeah, and the chlorinated chicken thing. I mean, there are a lot of concerns around like food regulations and how that can change when we leave, especially if we're going to talk about trade deals with the US. But that's actually something that's got the Scottish Whisky Association in a bit of a thing this week as well, because the legislation around what can and cannot be counted as whiskey is different. In Scotland, it's 4 years before it can be counted as whiskey. In America, I think it's 1 year.
1 or 2, yeah.
And if we go into this trade deal, then suddenly it's going to be a lot easier for bad whiskey to kind of get around, and it could have an impact in Scotland's market, which at the moment is very important to Scotland's economy. To stop it from.
But I mean, this whole thing about we're not going to we'll get a good trade deal on this. We'll get a good. It's about good or bad trade deals. Well, no, it isn't. It's about understanding that trade deals are negotiations, and you lose stuff as well as gaining stuff, and that's not being honestly talked about by any of the Brexit politicians or the Westminster government at all. I don't think. It's not, yes, we'll get we'll get a good trade deal. If it's not a good trade deal, we'll just walk away. Well, actually, no, you can't do that. That's not how these things work. And it can't, I think the arrogance and the assumption built in with that arrogance that, well, of course it'll be good for Britain is just astonishingly naive on behalf of those people who are supposedly doing the negotiations on our behalf. And I think that's the passports is clearly an issue. Although as somebody who's not a British citizen, I have experience of that, and maybe if more people experience difficulties with passports, we would change our immigration system and for the better. So but that's a whole other debate. But things like environmental standards, food regulations, whiskey standards, that kind of thing. It's not just of course we'll get the best thing going. That's not how trade negotiations work. And to present yet another lie, we'll get a good trade deal. If we don't, we'll just walk away. That's really, really problematic. That's so dishonest on behalf, on behalf of the Westminster government. It's something, as if we don't have enough other things to be talking about. We need to be making these arguments loudly and clearly for the people of Scotland and the people of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well. Northern Ireland. Whole other issue. Let's maybe not go there. But
I don't think we have time to get into that one. It's only about 5 minutes left.
I'd just like to say I think Maggie's missing the Dunkirk spirit. I think everything will be okay. I think if we got through the Blitz, we can get through Brexit, etc., etc.
See, that's the thing I love about this chat about the Dunkirk spirit. It's like, oh, you mean a disastrous retreat from Europe
exactly.
that went very badly for a lot of people. Yeah, but here's but here's another just point though, because I think obviously the Scotland voting to remain in the EU, as you brought up, and now being taken out despite that has been kind of a bit of a catalyst for bringing up the independence referendum, and probably not as successfully as someone originally thought. I think a few people are probably looking back at that and considering it was less of a strategic move than they thought at the time, because actually it just didn't really capture people's attention in the way that people maybe expected. I think people were expecting a much bigger surge towards independence following that.
Well,
result.
I also think it was too convoluted as well. There are a number of things taken into consideration. I mean, I think even for people who are not avowed British nationalists, their connections to Britain mattered more than a kind of newish progressive connection to Europe. For people like my friends, or many progressives that I'm close to, that's a clear choice. Obviously, they're going to choose the EU, but I think actually a lot of people who don't consider themselves to be hard-nosed would choose the UK if presented between older bonds. And this sounds very better together, so I'm going to get a tyrant of complaints, but there is that sense of competing loyalties. And I always thought that was a tricky thing to do, quite a flawed thing to do, to present that choice to people, because I think people have encountered this degree of uncertainty, and the natural reaction was, oh God, no, I don't want to have to make another choice. But again, obviously Brexit, the Brexit negotiations, are in their early stages. We haven't seen the full effect. We haven't seen the full economic and social effect, and who knows what's going to happen in the future.
And I mean, we're not going to by the leave date. Yeah, it's if we end up leaving, if it all goes as potentially disastrously as it might, it's going to be generations that suffer the impacts of a whole range of different economic and social things. That doesn't mean to say that everything's going to be rosy if we end up not leaving, or if Scotland does become independent and doesn't leave or rejoins. There are problems within the European Union, of course there are, but it's about something that is bigger than ourselves. And yeah, it comes back down to that sort of sense of Britishness and what that means to people, and it means nothing to me, I'm afraid.
But with the SWA, or Scottish Whisky Association specifically, I mean, they were actively part of the No campaign last time. They donated, they spoke out against. I mean, if they're now looking at this UK trade deal, essentially throwing them a little under the bus, I mean, are we going to see a shift? And maybe one of Scotland's largest industries starting to move over towards questioning whether or not
I'm curious.
Independent Scotland would be
I'm curious the price at which you buy people with moves like this, especially when it comes down to issues like corporation tax, for example. So I can imagine a certain section of the SNP. SNP is obviously it's a big church, but a certain wing of the SNP saying, well, we'll give you preferable deals on issues like tax or trade, or negotiate something special and unique for you, and that could shift them. But then there's the issue of the societal effects of drink, for example. There's this issue with trade deals with other countries. We might get bad or terrible trade deal with America, but we could also get a bad deal with you know, other countries that we negotiate with if we're independent part of the EU. So that I'm a bit worried about shifting people onto our side, especially institutions, and especially institutions that represent corporations, because the things you have to do to buy such support have to be, I think, weighed considerably.
And I mean, for me, as I said earlier on this afternoon, it's about an honesty in our democracy, and we don't have that. And we certainly don't have the transparency in our democracy that would allow those discussions to happen, because actually maybe it's legitimate to make those kinds of deals and things, but because they never happen openly, it always seems that they are clandestine. They become, you know, or those things only happen in smoke-filled, or not smoke-filled rooms anymore, but you know, that kind of idea, and that's part of the problem we've got to break. Those are exactly the power structures that we have to disentangle and unpick.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining me this week. That does bring us to the end of
Great.
this show. It's been an excellent discussion, so absolutely thank you very much for that, and thank you to everyone who
you.
joined in the comments section down below as well. So if you do want to listen back to this, or if you want to, I guess, consume it in a different way, you can also subscribe to Blether Together as a podcast. It's available on iTunes, and you can also get the RSS feed there to put it into whatever program you use to keep track of podcasts. We will be back again next week at 3 o'clock, as always, to talk about everything that happens from now until then, so please do tune in again. But other than that, thanks very much for both of you for joining me, and thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.